"Ma'am, get on your knees now." The command cut through the late afternoon air like a blade, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore, and for a brief second, even the traffic seemed to hesitate under the weight of it. General Danielle Brooks didn't move. The sun hung low over the street, casting long amber shadows across the pavement, catching the polished edges of her U.S. Army uniform, the ribbons aligned with surgical precision, the silver stars resting quietly on her shoulders as if they carried their own gravity. Around her, phones were already rising, small black rectangles pointed like silent witnesses, recording a moment no one fully understood, yet everyone felt compelled to capture. Officer Ryan Keller stepped closer, his boots scraping against the asphalt, his voice firmer this time, edged with authority that came too easily. "I said on your knees." A murmur rippled through the small crowd gathering along the sidewalk, a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and something unspoken that lingered heavier than the heat. Danielle's eyes moved slowly, not in defiance, not in fear, but in careful observation, taking in the faces, the uniforms, the flashing red and blue lights that painted the scene in restless color. She had stood in deserts where the air burned hotter than this, had walked through silence thicker than any tension on this street, had made decisions that carried the weight of lives far beyond this moment. And yet here, in the middle of a quiet American block, she felt something colder settle beneath her skin. Keller reached for the cuffs at his belt, the metal catching the light as he spoke again, louder now, for everyone to hear. "You are being detained." The words landed heavier than they should have, not because of their volume, but because of their certainty. A woman across the street whispered, "Isn't she military?" But no one answered. Danielle finally moved, slow, deliberate, lowering herself just enough to meet the moment without surrendering to it, her posture still carrying a quiet dignity that refused to break even as the situation tightened around her. The fabric of her uniform shifted softly, the faint sound of it brushing against itself almost lost beneath the hum of engines and distant sirens. Keller stepped behind her, the cold click of metal closing around her wrists echoing louder than it should have, a sound that seemed to ripple outward, silencing the small fragments of conversation in the crowd. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to that single sensation, the pressure of steel, the rhythm of her breathing, the steady, unshaken calm in her chest. A young boy standing near the curb tugged at his mother's sleeve, his voice small but clear in the sudden quiet. "Why are they arresting a soldier?" No one answered him either. Danielle lifted her gaze slightly, not toward Keller, not toward the cameras, but somewhere just beyond them, as if measuring something invisible, something far more important than what anyone else could see. Then, in a voice so calm it almost didn't belong to the chaos around her, she spoke. "Before you take me in, I need to make one call." The metal of the handcuffs rested cold against Danielle Brooks's wrists, but her posture did not change, her spine still straight, her chin level, as if the weight of the moment could not bend what years of discipline had built. The flashing patrol lights washed over her uniform in waves of red and blue, catching on the edges of her service ribbons, the small details that most people on that street could not read, but somehow still felt, even if they did not understand why. A breeze moved down the block, light but steady, stirring the loose edges of caution tape nearby, and carrying with it the faint scent of asphalt warmed by the day. And Danielle let herself take one slow breath, measured, controlled, the same way she had done before stepping into briefing rooms where every decision mattered. Officer Ryan Keller stood just behind her shoulder, radio clipped to his vest, his jaw tight with a confidence that came from routine rather than reflection, and he gave a short shake of his head when she had asked to make a call, dismissing it without a second thought. "You can make your call downtown," he said, voice flat, already turning slightly as if the situation was settled, as if she were just another name on a report that would be filed and forgotten by the end of his shift. Danielle did not respond immediately. Instead, her eyes moved again, this time lower, catching the reflection of herself in the glossy surface of a nearby car door, the image slightly distorted but still clear enough to remind her of exactly who she was, not just the rank, not just the uniform, but the years behind it, the mornings before sunrise, the long miles, the weight of responsibility carried quietly without recognition. A man standing a few feet away lowered his phone for a moment, his brow furrowed, uncertainty beginning to replace the passive curiosity that had brought him there. And somewhere behind him, a car door shut with a hollow thud that echoed strangely loud in the thickening silence. Danielle shifted her hands slightly within the cuffs, not to resist, but to steady the small pressure point at her wrist, a subtle adjustment that spoke more of awareness than discomfort. And when she spoke again, her voice remained even, neither raised nor pleading, simply present. "Officer, I understand your position," she said, each word deliberate, clear enough to cut through the low murmur of the crowd. "But I am asking you, respectfully, to allow me one phone call before we go any further." Keller exhaled through his nose, a brief sound of impatience, and glanced toward the growing number of onlookers, as if weighing not her words, but the optics of the moment, the cameras, the attention, the possibility that something here might not be as simple as it first appeared. His radio crackled softly at his shoulder, a burst of static followed by a distant voice he ignored, and for a second, just a second, there was a flicker of hesitation that passed across his face, quick enough that most would miss it, but not Danielle. She held his gaze, not challenging, not yielding, simply steady, the kind of steadiness that did not demand authority but carried it anyway. Somewhere down the block, a flag stirred on its pole, the fabric catching the light as it shifted, and Danielle's eyes followed it briefly, a quiet anchor in the middle of everything else, before returning to Keller. The street had grown quieter now, the earlier whispers replaced by a heavier silence, one that pressed in from all sides, waiting, watching, as if the entire moment balanced on something unseen, something just about to change. Keller adjusted his grip on the cuffs, then paused, his fingers lingering for a fraction longer than necessary, and finally said, "Make it quick." The words reluctant, almost defensive, as though granting the request meant acknowledging a doubt he was not ready to face. Danielle gave a small nod, not of gratitude, but of acknowledgment, and slowly, carefully, she turned her head slightly, eyes lowering as she recited a number from memory, each digit placed with precision, her voice quiet but unwavering, as if every sound around her had faded into the background, leaving only the rhythm of the call she was about to make. The number left her lips in a steady rhythm, each digit spoken with the kind of precision that came from repetition, from memory trained under pressure, and as she finished, a brief silence followed, the kind that stretched just long enough to make the world feel suspended. Officer Ryan Keller watched her closely now, no longer dismissive, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to place something that did not quite fit the version of events he had already decided was true. The phone, held carefully between her cuffed hands, rang once, then twice, the sound faint but somehow louder than the distant hum of traffic, and Danielle Brooks did not rush it, did not shift her stance, did not allow even the smallest crack in her composure, because she understood something most people in that moment did not. That control was not about force, it was about stillness. Around them, the crowd had grown thicker, the earlier curiosity now edged with tension, and a man near the front lowered his voice as he spoke to someone beside him. "That uniform, that is not just for show." But again, no one answered, as if acknowledging it out loud might change what they were witnessing. Keller adjusted his posture, one hand resting near his radio, the other hovering uncertainly at his side, and for the first time since the moment began, his gaze flicked briefly to the insignia on Danielle's chest, the small details he had ignored now pulling at his attention, quietly demanding to be seen. The call connected. Danielle did not raise her voice, did not announce herself with rank or demand. She simply spoke, calm and direct. "This is General Danielle Brooks," she said, her tone even, carrying neither urgency nor hesitation, only clarity. "I am currently being detained at the corner of Maple and 3rd. I need immediate verification." There was a pause on the other end, short but noticeable, and then a response, low and formal, words that the crowd could not hear, but that seemed to shift something invisible in the air. Danielle listened without interrupting, her eyes steady, her breathing unchanged, and when she replied, it was with the same measured control. "Yes, sir. I will remain here." She ended the call as quietly as she had made it, lowering the phone slightly, her hands still bound, her posture unchanged, but something had shifted, not outwardly, not yet, but in a way that settled beneath the surface like a current about to rise. Keller cleared his throat, a small, involuntary sound, and stepped half a pace closer, his voice no longer as certain as before. "Who exactly did you just call?" he asked, the question framed as authority but edged with something else now, something closer to doubt. Danielle turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, not confrontational, not defensive, simply present. "Someone who will confirm what I already told you," she said, her voice quiet, almost gentle, but firm in a way that did not invite argument. The radio at Keller's shoulder crackled again, louder this time, a burst of static followed by a voice that cut through the tension with sudden clarity, calling his unit number, once, then again, more urgently. Keller hesitated, his hand moving to the device, but he did not respond immediately, as if part of him already understood that whatever came next would not fit the narrative he had been holding on to. The crowd leaned in, not physically, but in attention, the collective awareness tightening around the moment, and somewhere behind them, the young boy who had spoken earlier looked up again, his eyes fixed on Danielle with a kind of quiet curiosity that had not yet learned to doubt what it saw. The wind shifted slightly, lifting the edge of Danielle's uniform, and for a brief second, the light caught the stars on her shoulders just right, reflecting them outward, not as decoration, but as something earned, something real, something that could not be erased by misunderstanding. Keller finally pressed the button on his radio, his voice lower now, more cautious. "This is Officer Keller. Go ahead." The response came immediately, sharper than before, carrying a weight that did not need to be explained, and as the first words reached him, the color in his face changed almost imperceptibly, the certainty that had defined him moments ago beginning to unravel in silence. The voice on the radio did not repeat itself. It did not need to, and whatever it said carried a weight that settled instantly into Officer Ryan Keller's posture, straightening him in a way that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with realization. His fingers tightened slightly around the device, knuckles paling just enough to show the shift, and for a brief moment he did not respond, as if his mind needed an extra second to catch up with what his ears had already understood. "Confirm that," he said finally, but the firmness in his voice was gone, replaced by something more careful, more measured, and the reply came back sharper, unmistakable this time, layered with identifiers and protocol language that left no room for interpretation. The street, which had been filled with small sounds just moments ago, seemed to pull inward, the background noise fading as attention narrowed toward him, toward the exchange that no one else could fully hear, but everyone could feel changing the air. Keller swallowed once, a subtle motion, then lowered the radio slightly, his gaze drifting back to Danielle Brooks. But now it was different, no longer scanning her as a suspect, but reassessing, recalculating, as if the image in front of him had just rewritten itself without warning. The insignia on her shoulders no longer looked like decoration. It looked like something he should have recognized from the beginning. He stepped back half a pace, the distance small but significant, creating space where before there had been control, and the shift did not go unnoticed by the people watching. A woman near the curb lowered her phone slowly, her expression tightening with the first signs of understanding, while the young boy from earlier leaned forward slightly, his question still unanswered, but now closer to being resolved in a way he could feel even if he could not yet explain. Danielle remained exactly as she had been, her hands still cuffed, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, and in that stillness there was no triumph, no visible reaction, only patience, the kind that did not rush outcomes because it already knew where they were going. Keller cleared his throat again, this time quieter, and moved his hand toward the cuffs, but he hesitated, not out of uncertainty about what to do, but because the act itself now carried a weight he had not considered before, the reversal already unfolding in. Silence around him. "Ma'am," he said, the word coming out differently than before, stripped of its earlier edge. "There seems to be some clarification." The phrasing faltered slightly, as if language itself was struggling to keep pace with the shift in reality, and he glanced once more at his radio, as if expecting it to speak again and confirm what he was already beginning to accept. Danielle turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her eyes steady, neither forgiving nor condemning, simply present, and that presence seemed to steady the moment more than anything else. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice unchanged, carrying no trace of accusation, only a calm acknowledgment that did not need to press further. The breeze moved through the street again, lighter now, lifting the edges of uniforms and clothing, and somewhere down the block a car engine started, the normal sounds of the world beginning to return as the tension loosened its grip. Keller finally reached for the cuffs again, his movements slower, more deliberate, the metal no longer just a tool but a reminder. And as his fingers touched them, the faint clink echoed softly, a small sound that seemed to carry far beyond its size. Around them, the crowd shifted, not dispersing yet, but changing, the earlier curiosity replaced by something quieter, more reflective, as if each person was adjusting their understanding of what they had just witnessed. Danielle did not move to hurry the moment, did not pull away or react. She simply stood there, grounded, composed, allowing the scene to unfold at its own pace. And in that stillness, the balance of power had already changed long before the cuffs would come off. The faint metallic click that followed seemed almost too small to carry the weight of what it meant, yet it echoed in the space between them with unmistakable clarity as Officer Ryan Keller loosened his grip and carefully removed the cuffs from Danielle Brooks's wrists, his movements slower now, deliberate in a way that suggested not hesitation but awareness, as if each second required more attention than the last. The red marks left behind on her skin were subtle, already fading under the evening light, and she did not rub them, did not react, simply lowering her hands naturally to her sides as though nothing had been taken from her in the first place. Keller stepped back immediately after, creating a distance that had not existed before, his posture shifting from control to something closer to formality, though it lacked the structure of training and instead carried the uneven weight of someone adjusting in real time. "General Brooks," he said, the title coming with a slight pause, as if he were still aligning himself with the reality of it. And for a moment, he did not continue. The rest of his words caught somewhere between intention and uncertainty. The radio at his shoulder remained quiet now, but its earlier interruptions still lingered in the air, like a signal that had already changed everything whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Danielle flexed her fingers once, subtle and controlled, restoring circulation without drawing attention, then lifted her gaze to meet Keller's, not sharply, not with expectation, simply present, the same calm that had carried her through every second of the encounter still intact. Around them, the crowd had shifted again, no longer leaning in with curiosity, but holding a different kind of stillness, one shaped by recognition, by the slow realization that what they had witnessed was not what it first appeared to be. A man who had been recording lowered his phone completely this time, his shoulders dropping slightly, while a woman beside him exhaled quietly, her earlier tension releasing into something more reflective. The young boy stepped closer to the curb, his eyes fixed on Danielle, not confused anymore, but watching with a kind of quiet understanding that did not need explanation. Keller adjusted his stance, his hands now resting at his sides rather than near his equipment, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured, stripped of the edge that had defined it earlier. "There has been a misunderstanding," he said, each word chosen carefully, but even as he spoke them, they seemed insufficient, too small to account for what had already taken place. Danielle listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, not dismissing his words, but not accepting them as resolution either, because the moment required more than language to balance itself. A faint hum of a vehicle approached from down the street, growing gradually louder, its presence not yet visible but already felt, drawing a few heads to turn in its direction, curiosity returning in a different form. Keller glanced briefly toward the sound, then back to Danielle, as if measuring how much more of the situation was still beyond his control, and for the first time, there was something like humility in the way he held himself, not fully formed, but present enough to be seen. Danielle shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself evenly on both feet, her uniform settling back into place with quiet precision, the lines once again uninterrupted, and in that simple adjustment, there was a return to something larger than the moment itself, something that had never truly left. She did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to hold, allowing the space to exist without forcing it closed, and in that silence, the balance had fully turned, not through confrontation, not through force, but through clarity, steady and undeniable, leaving behind a scene that no longer belonged to the assumptions it had begun with. The approaching sound resolved into a low, steady engine hum, smooth and controlled, different from the uneven rhythm of the traffic that had filled the street earlier, and as the vehicle turned the corner, its presence drew the attention of everyone still standing there, not because it moved fast, but because it moved with purpose. A dark government sedan rolled to a precise stop along the curb, its polished surface reflecting the fading light of the evening sky, and for a moment, no one spoke, as if the scene itself understood that something larger had just entered it. The rear door opened without hesitation, and a man in a crisp uniform stepped out, his posture exact, his movements economical, every detail aligned with discipline rather than display. And as his eyes settled on Danielle Brooks, there was no confusion, no need for confirmation, only recognition. He walked toward her with measured steps, the sound of his shoes against the pavement quiet but distinct, and when he stopped a few feet away, he stood straight, his voice calm and clear. "General Brooks," he said, not loudly, but with a precision that carried across the silence, and then he held his position, waiting, not for instruction, but for acknowledgment. Danielle met his gaze and gave a slight nod, nothing more, but it was enough, a simple exchange that restored a structure the moment had lost. Around them, the air shifted again, not tense now, but still, the kind of stillness that comes after something important has already happened and is still settling into place. Officer Ryan Keller remained where he stood, his shoulders squared but no longer rigid, his eyes moving briefly from Danielle to the arriving officer and back again, as if measuring the distance between what he had assumed and what he now understood. The difference was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. The arriving officer turned slightly, his attention moving toward Keller, and though he did not raise his voice, the weight in it changed. "Officer," he said, "this situation has been reviewed." The words were simple, but they carried a finality that required no elaboration, and Keller gave a small nod, his response immediate, almost instinctive, as if something in him recognized that this was no longer his moment to control. Danielle remained still for another second, letting the scene complete itself without interruption. Then she adjusted her sleeves lightly, smoothing the fabric where it had shifted, restoring the clean lines of her uniform with a quiet precision that spoke more than any words could. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried the weight of everything that had just occurred, a return to order not through force, but through presence. A soft breeze passed through again, lifting the edge of the flag down the street, its colors catching the last light of the day, and for a moment, the entire block seemed to breathe differently, the earlier tension replaced by something calmer, something clearer. The young boy stepped forward just slightly, no longer pulling at his mother's sleeve, simply watching, and in his eyes there was no longer confusion, only understanding beginning to form. Keller took a slow breath, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to Danielle, and though he did not speak, the shift in him was visible, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but real, the kind of change that begins quietly and settles over time. Danielle turned her head once more toward the arriving officer, her voice steady as she spoke. "Thank you for coming." It was not relief in her tone, not even gratitude in the usual sense, but acknowledgment, measured and complete. The officer inclined his head slightly in return, then stepped back half a pace, giving her space, not because he needed to, but because he understood exactly who stood in front of him. And in that quiet exchange, under the fading light and the soft hum of a city returning to itself, the moment reached a still point where nothing needed to be forced, nothing needed to be proven, because everything that mattered had already been made clear. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned, as if the street itself had stepped back to make room for something more important than noise. And in that quiet, General Danielle Brooks finally shifted her stance, not to leave, not yet, but to face Officer Ryan Keller fully for the first time since the moment began. The movement was calm, controlled, her boots aligning squarely with the pavement, her shoulders settling beneath the weight of her uniform in a way that restored its full presence. Keller straightened instinctively, not because he was told to, but because something in her posture demanded it without a word. and when their eyes met, there was no longer confusion in his, only the clear recognition of a mistake that could not be undone by procedure alone. The crowd remained still, watching, not with curiosity now, but with attention sharpened by understanding, as if they knew this next moment carried more meaning than everything that had come before. Danielle studied him for a brief second, not to judge, not to challenge, but to see, truly see the person standing in front of her, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, grounded, carrying neither anger nor softness, only truth. "You followed what you thought was right," she said, each word placed carefully. "But authority without awareness can lead you in the wrong direction." The sentence did not rise in volume, yet it carried across the space with clarity, settling into the air like something that would not easily fade. Keller's jaw tightened slightly, not in defense, but in acceptance, and he gave a small nod, the motion restrained but sincere, his gaze lowering for a moment before returning to her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the words quieter now, stripped of any earlier certainty, replaced by something closer to humility, and though the phrase was simple, it carried a different weight than it had before, shaped by the realization behind it. Danielle held his gaze for another second, then continued, her tone unchanged, calm but firm. "Respect is not something you verify after the fact," she said. "It is something you choose in the moment, especially when it is not obvious." The breeze moved again, softer this time, carrying the faint rustle of leaves from a nearby tree, and the sound seemed to underline her words without interrupting them. The young boy stepped forward just a little more, his small shoes scraping lightly against the curb, his eyes fixed on Danielle as if trying to hold on to every word, and beside him, his mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, not pulling him back, but steadying him, allowing him to witness something important. Keller inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling with the breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was measured, careful. "I understand," he said, and though the words were common, the way he said them made them different, less like a response and more like a realization forming in real time. Danielle gave a slight nod, not approving, not dismissing, simply acknowledging that something had shifted, that the moment had done its work. The officer who had arrived earlier remained just behind her, silent, observant, his presence steady but unobtrusive, allowing the exchange to unfold without interference, as if he understood that this part did not belong to him. The crowd began to ease, not dispersing all at once, but softening, conversations returning in low tones, phones lowering, shoulders relaxing, the intensity of the moment giving way to something quieter, something reflective. Danielle turned slightly then, her gaze moving past Keller toward the length of the street, the familiar shape of everyday life beginning to reassemble itself, and in that glance, there was no lingering tension, no need to hold on to what had already passed. She adjusted her uniform once more, smoothing the line of her sleeve with a precise, practiced motion, then stepped forward, not hurried, not slow, simply moving with purpose, leaving behind a moment that had already changed everyone who had witnessed it, whether they realized it yet or not. The sound of Danielle Brooks's footsteps against the pavement was steady, unhurried, each step measured as she moved away from the center of the street, the fading light catching briefly on the edges of her uniform before softening into the evening. The crowd parted without being asked, not out of fear, but out of something quieter, a recognition that did not need words to guide it. Behind her, Officer Ryan Keller remained still for a moment longer, watching her go, the weight of what had just happened settling into him. In layers, each second making it clearer that this was not something that would simply pass when the street returned to normal. He took a breath, deeper this time, then stepped forward, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without breaking the calm that had formed. "General Brooks," he said, and the way he spoke her name now was different, not just correct, but intentional. Danielle stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a natural pause, as if she had expected the call and allowed it the space to arrive. She turned slightly, her expression composed, her eyes steady, giving him her attention without inviting anything unnecessary. Keller closed the distance by a few steps, not too close, careful now in a way he had not been before, and for a moment, he seemed to search for the right words, his usual certainty replaced by something more honest, something less rehearsed. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. The sentence simple, but spoken without deflection, without excuse, and in that simplicity, it carried more weight than anything he could have added. The street held its breath again, not tense this time, but attentive, as if understanding that this moment mattered in a different way. Danielle regarded him quietly, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded, neither accepting nor rejecting his words outright. "An apology is a start," she said, "but understanding is what changes what happens next." Keller nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, as if he were committing the words to memory rather than just hearing them, and he lowered his gaze briefly before meeting hers again. "I will remember that," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, only a quiet resolve that had not been there before. A soft breeze moved through the space between them, lifting a few strands of dust along the pavement, and somewhere in the distance, a door closed, the sound blending into the rhythm of a city returning to itself. Danielle held his gaze for one more second, then gave a slight nod, not as forgiveness, not as approval, but as acknowledgment, a recognition that something had shifted, even if it was only the beginning. She turned again, continuing her path toward the waiting sedan, her steps just as steady as before, her uniform catching the last traces of daylight as the sky deepened into early evening. The officer who had arrived earlier opened the rear door without a word, stepping aside with a quiet precision that matched her movement, and Danielle paused briefly before entering, her hand resting lightly against the frame of the door for just a moment, grounding herself in the present before moving forward. Behind her, Keller remained where he stood, no longer the center of the scene, no longer the one directing its course, but part of it, changed by it, his posture reflecting something quieter now, something more aware. The crowd began to disperse gradually, conversations returning in low tones, the earlier intensity dissolving into reflection, and as Danielle stepped into the vehicle, the door closing softly behind her, the street seemed to exhale, the moment settling into memory not as noise or spectacle, but as something deeper, something that would remain long after the lights faded and the cameras were put away. The sedan door closed with a soft, final sound that seemed to seal the moment behind it, and inside, the world shifted into a quiet stillness, the noise of the street reduced to a distant hum beyond the glass. General Danielle Brooks sat upright, her posture unchanged, her hands resting calmly in her lap, the faint imprint of the cuffs already fading as if they had never belonged there in the first place. Outside, the vehicle pulled away slowly, not in urgency, but with a steady, controlled motion that matched the tone of everything that had just unfolded, the street receding behind them inch by inch until it became just another part of the city, indistinguishable from any other block to those who had not witnessed what had happened. Danielle's gaze moved briefly to the window, catching the reflection of her own uniform in the glass, the stars on her shoulders steady, unchanged, a quiet reminder that identity does not shift with perception, only with understanding. She exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in completion, as if the moment had reached its natural end exactly as it was meant to, no more, no less. In the front seat, the officer who had come to meet her remained silent, his presence respectful, unobtrusive, allowing the space to remain hers, and for several seconds, nothing was said, the quiet filled only by the low rhythm of the engine and the soft passing of light. Across the interior as they moved through the city. Back on the street, Officer Ryan Keller stood where he had been left, the space around him now open, the crowd gone, the echoes of the moment settling into something that would not easily fade. He looked down briefly at his hands, then up again at the empty stretch of pavement where Danielle had stood, and though nothing physical remained, the weight of it was still there, shaping the way he held himself, the way he would move forward from this point on. The young boy lingered a moment longer with his mother, his eyes still fixed on the direction the car had gone, and then he asked quietly, "Was she important?" His mother paused, considering the question, then placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and answered just as softly, "She knew who she was." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling the truth in it, and together they turned to walk away, their footsteps blending into the ordinary rhythm of the evening. Inside the sedan, Danielle closed her eyes for a brief second, not to escape the moment, but to let it settle, to place it where it belonged among all the others she had carried through years of service. And when she opened them again, there was no tension left, only clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. The city lights began to glow brighter as dusk deepened, casting reflections across the glass that moved like quiet signals, and the vehicle continued forward, steady, uninterrupted, carrying her toward whatever came next without hesitation. There were no final words, no declarations, no need to explain what had already been made clear. The strength of the moment remained in its silence, in the way it had unfolded without force, without noise, leaving behind something far more lasting than confrontation ever could. And as the car disappeared into the flow of the city, the only thing that lingered was the quiet certainty that dignity, once held, does not need to be defended loudly, because it speaks in ways the world eventually learns to hear.